In most American memories, Andrew Johnson appears as a stubborn silhouette between two giants. The tailor from Tennessee, who followed Abraham Lincoln into the White House and very nearly lost it in an impeachment trial. He is the president remembered for clashes with Congress, for resisting radical Reconstruction, for surviving removal from office by a single vote. But far from the Senate chamber where his fate was decided, there was a very different arena where he had no parliamentary rules to hide behind, his own household in Greeneville, Tennessee. There, the man who rose from illiterate apprentice to president tried to be something history never trained him for, and never forgave him for failing at: a steady husband and father. Andrew Johnson married Eliza McCardle when he was still a poor young tailor, barely educated, scarred by poverty and humiliation. She was quiet, literate, and determined. Legend has it that Eliza helped teach him to read and write more fluently, sitting with him over books after long days at the bench. Together, they built a life that was as hard as the land they farmed. Long hours in the shop, debts, political fights in a town that did not always welcome Johnson's relentless ambition. In the middle of that grinding climb, 5 children arrived in rapid succession: Martha, Charles, Mary, Robert, and much later, the youngest, Andrew Jr., called Frank. They did not grow up in a presidential mansion, but in a cramped house above and behind the tailor shop, where their father's temper, pride, and political obsessions filled every room. As Johnson climbed from local office to Congress, governor, senator, and finally vice president, his children watched their world stretch from Greeneville's dusty streets to Washington's salons and back again. They saw a man who could speak to poor white voters with raw power, yet who often spoke to his own family in tones sharpened by insecurity and drink. The Civil War tore their universe open. Johnson's decision to stay loyal to the Union while remaining a slaveholder put his family in a dangerous middle ground, despised by Confederates, distrusted by many Unionists. His sons served in the Union Army. His daughters navigated towns where their father's name could provoke either cheers or open hatred. When Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson suddenly became president in 1865, the family moved into a White House still draped in grief, where servants whispered comparisons, politicians plotted, and the Johnson children found themselves in a place that had never been meant for them. Inside that pressure cooker, each child responded differently. One daughter became the de facto hostess of the White House, standing beside a father whose political isolation grew by the month. Another retreated more deeply into the domestic sphere, carrying the family's sorrows in silence. One son drank himself into an early grave after the war. Another died in a wartime accident that shattered what was left of Johnson's emotional reserves. The youngest tried to find his place in business and public life, amid a legacy he was too young to fully understand and too marked to escape. This is the story of Andrew Johnson and his 5 children, the fragile constellation around a man who rose higher than his upbringing ever predicted, and who fell harder than his family could withstand. In this series, we will move from number 5 to number 1, tracing the lives of the children who inherited not only their father's name, but the burden of his choices, his rage, his failures, and the stubborn pride that both lifted and destroyed him. Number 5. Andrew Johnson Jr. Frank. Number 5 is Andrew Johnson Jr., known to his family simply as Frank, the youngest child, born in 1852. Nearly a decade after his older siblings, and at the moment when Andrew Johnson was rising from local politician to national figure, Frank entered a household already shaped by sharp contrasts: a father consumed by ambition and political combat, and a mother whose quiet resilience held the family together. But unlike his siblings, who remembered the cramped tailor shop and the early years of poverty, Frank was born into a home already tasting the first fruits of national prominence. That difference would shape both the opportunities he received and the weight he carried. Frank spent his earliest childhood in Greeneville, but by the time he began forming memories, his father was serving as military governor of Tennessee during the Civil War. The Johnson name, once merely local, had become a target, admired by Unionists, despised by Confederates. For a sensitive, bookish child, It was a strange burden. He was protected by soldiers, scrutinized by neighbors, and surrounded by the political arguments that consumed Andrew Johnson's every waking hour. The stark turning point of Frank's life came when his father became vice president and, within weeks, president of the United States after Lincoln's assassination. Still only 13, he was suddenly living in the White House, a place vibrating with grief, suspicion, and political fury. His older siblings took on ceremonial or support roles. But Frank remained the child in the background, the quiet observer in hallways where cabinet secretaries argued, where reporters hovered, where whispers of impeachment began long before formal charges were filed. Andrew Johnson, already prone to brooding and bouts of drinking, became more volatile under the pressures of the presidency. Those who knew the family said Frank received both his father's love and his father's expectations in overwhelming doses. Andrew wanted at least one child to rise above obscurity, to claim a place in business or politics that might soften the stain of his tumultuous presidency. Frank tried to answer that hope. After leaving the White House, Frank pursued business, first in Tennessee and later in Washington. His father placed immense confidence in him, granting him responsibility for family estates and business interests. But like many children who grow up inside political storms, Frank struggled with the quiet discipline required for financial life. He was intelligent but inconsistent, earnest but easily discouraged. He carried the Johnson name into industries where skepticism followed him like a shadow. The final turn of Frank's life was a tragic one. In 1879, at just 26 years old, he died of tuberculosis, a disease that moved quickly and mercilessly. His death was not only a personal loss for the Johnson family, it was a symbolic one. Andrew Johnson had pinned his hopes on Frank, believing the youngest son might redeem the family legacy after the losses of his older boys. Instead, Frank's death left the Johnson line without the successor Andrew imagined, and without the stability the family desperately needed. Frank Johnson's legacy is quiet, unfinished, overshadowed by the turbulence of his father's life. He represents the child born into the highest point of a parent's rise, yet crushed beneath the weight of its aftermath. If Andrew Johnson's presidency exposed the fractures of a nation, Frank's short life exposed the fractures inside the Johnson home itself. The fragility of a family stretched too thin by history. Do you want me to continue with number 4? Number 4. Robert Johnson. Number 4 is Robert Johnson. Born in 1843, the son whose life carried the quietest footprint in public memory, yet whose fate most clearly reflected the private costs of the Johnson family's long, grinding ascent. Robert grew up in the cramped rooms above Andrew Johnson's tailor shop, long before the family tasted national attention. He knew the sound of scissors on cloth, the reek of dye, the fatigue that followed his father home from work late each night. He was raised in poverty, in a household taught with Andrew's pride and temper, but also with Eliza's steadiness and determination. Where his older siblings inherited their father's force of will, Robert inherited his mother's gentleness. He was the calmest of the Johnson children, the least drawn to confrontation, the most comfortable moving through the world without demanding attention. In a family built on Andrew's unrelenting upward drive, Robert's quiet temperament stood almost as a counterpoint. The turning point in Robert's life came with the Civil War, when Tennessee split between Union and Confederate sympathies, and Andrew Johnson, then a U.S. Senator, chose to remain loyal to the Union. The Johnson children were thrust into danger. Robert joined his brother Charles in military service, fighting for the Union at a time when their home state branded such loyalty as betrayal. His military career was not marked by fame or scandal, but by steady, dutiful service, the kind of soldiering that rarely makes headlines, yet carries the emotional weight of war all the same. After the war, as Andrew Johnson's political battles intensified in Washington, Robert returned to Tennessee. He tried to manage the family's business affairs, helping stabilize properties and finances that had been strained by the war and by Andrew's divided focus. But his health, always fragile, deteriorated. The strain of wartime service, compounded by the stress of living under his father's political shadow, left him weakened. Tuberculosis took hold, the same disease that would later claim his youngest brother, Frank. Robert died in 1869 at just 26 years old, only a few months after his father had left the presidency. His death was a devastating blow inside the family, one felt most sharply by Eliza, who had already endured the assassination of Lincoln, the viciousness of Andrew's impeachment, and the relentless public attacks on their household. For Andrew Johnson, Robert's death compounded a pattern already emerging, a family being slowly hollowed out by illness, stress, and the unseen casualties of political life. Robert Johnson's legacy is one of quiet sacrifice. He was not the son who carried ambitions for office, nor the one who caused scandal, nor the one destined to become the family heir. He was the son who served, who returned home, who tried to keep the fragile pieces of the family intact until illness carried him away. His life reflects the private toll behind the public drama, the way political storms fracture families long before they fracture nations. Number 3. Mary Bell Johnson. Number 3 is Mary Bell Johnson. Born in 1850, the quieter of the two Johnson daughters, and the child whose life unfolded largely in the shadows cast by her father's meteoric political rise and corrosive national downfall. While her sister Martha became Andrew Johnson's public-facing hostess, Mary remained deeply embedded in the private emotional world of the family, where loss, exhaustion, and loyalty shaped her far more than politics ever did. Mary's early life was defined by instability. She grew up in the cramped tailor shop rooms of Greeneville, then in the slightly larger but still modest family home, all while watching her father climb from alderman to mayor, to state legislator to congressman. These shifts meant constant changes in household routines, new responsibilities, longer absences from Andrew, and, always, the tension his political battles dragged into the home. Eliza, frail in health but unyielding in spirit, leaned heavily on Mary as she grew, a dynamic that would intensify over the decades. The turning point in Mary's life came during the Civil War. As Andrew Johnson declared loyalty to the Union and Confederate sympathizers in Tennessee grew increasingly hostile, the Johnson family became a symbol of defiance and target of resentment. Mary, only a young teenager, endured threats, property damage, and the isolation that came from being aligned with a father despised by many in their region. While her brothers went off to fight, Mary became part of the domestic defense, protecting the home, supporting her mother, and enduring the psychological toll of living in a divided state. When Andrew Johnson unexpectedly became vice president in 1865 and then president after Lincoln's assassination, Mary's world shifted again. Moving to Washington thrust her into a society that viewed her father with suspicion, disdain, or outright hostility. Unlike Martha, who stepped reluctantly into the role of White House hostess, Mary preferred to remain out of the spotlight. She managed personal affairs, assisted her mother and niece, and helped stabilize the household during one of the most turbulent presidencies in American history. Mary carried the family's private burdens. She tended to her mother's declining health, mourned the deaths of her brothers Charles and Robert, and watched her youngest sibling Frank fight and lose his battle with tuberculosis. While Andrew Johnson raged publicly against Congress, vetoed Reconstruction acts, and fought impeachment, Mary absorbed the emotional debris behind the scenes. Her adult life remained tied to Greeneville. After the presidency, she continued to live with her parents, functioning as both caretaker and companion. Especially as Eliza's health deteriorated, Mary never married, a choice shaped not by lack of opportunity but by the demands of her family and the emotional landscape she had inherited. Mary Bell Johnson's legacy is not measured in public deeds, but in endurance. She represents the countless daughters in American political households whose contributions are invisible yet essential. The ones who hold families together while public battles tear them apart. Through Mary, we see the Johnson story not as a tale of national conflict alone, but as a domestic tragedy, one where a daughter absorbed far more pain than history ever recorded. Number 2. Charles Johnson. Number 2 is Charles Johnson, born in 1830, the eldest son of Andrew and Eliza Johnson, and the child whose life most directly mirrored the turbulence, ambition, and fatal costs of his father's political world. Charles was the son who inherited Andrew's intensity, his desire to prove himself, and his instinct for confrontation. But unlike his father, Charles never found a stable channel for that drive. Instead, his life unfolded as a series of bright, violent turns that ended abruptly, making him the first of the Johnson children to be claimed by the same forces that would unravel the entire family. Charles grew up in a household defined by poverty, long hours, and a father whose temper was sharpened by insecurity and political ambition. He was the Johnson child who remembered most vividly the humiliation of Andrew's early life. The jeers from wealthier townspeople, the stigma of being the son of an illiterate tailor, the relentless pressure to rise. Those memories forged Charles into a young man fiercely protective of his family's honor and fiercely resentful of anything that threatened it. The turning point in Charles's life came with the Civil War. When Tennessee splintered and Andrew Johnson declared loyalty to the Union, Charles followed without hesitation. He enlisted in the Union Army, serving as assistant surgeon with the 10th Tennessee Infantry Union. His decision was both political and deeply personal. The Johnson men would not be seen as cowards or traitors. War offered a place to prove himself and a cause to justify his rage. But military service also exposed Charles to the brutal reality of violence, exhaustion, and the disillusionment that came when ideals cracked under the weight of war. Those who knew him said the conflict hardened him further, darkening the edges of a temperament already prone to volatility. Alcohol became both companion and accelerant, a force that worsened as the family's political profile rose. When Andrew Johnson became vice president in 1865, and then president after Lincoln's assassination, Charles carried into Washington not the polish of a political heir, but the rawness of a man used to battlefields and taverns. He frequently clashed with his father, and his drinking drew increasing concern. Andrew Johnson, who had his own long struggle with alcohol, tried to intervene. But the relationship between father and son was strained, combustible, and often heartbreaking. Then came the moment that ended it. In April 1869, 2 months after Andrew Johnson left the presidency, Charles died from injuries sustained in a drunken fall from a horse. He was 39. His body, battered from war and years of drinking, could not survive the accident. His death broke what remained of the family's emotional strength. Andrew, already reeling from public humiliation and the weight of impeachment, withdrew further into grief. Eliza weakened rapidly. Mary and Martha became guardians of a household shaped increasingly by loss. Charles Johnson's legacy is that of the son who bore the brunt of his father's rise and his father's demons. His story exposes the violent edge of political ambition, not just on battlefields or Senate floors, but inside kitchens and parlors, inside the hearts of children who grew up in the storm. Charles stands as a reminder that families often pay a price. Number 1. Martha Johnson Patterson. Number 1 is Martha Johnson Patterson, born in 1832, the eldest child. The daughter who became Andrew Johnson's public shield, domestic strategist, and emotional anchor during the most volatile presidency the United States had ever endured. If Charles embodied his father's fury and Robert embodied his mother's gentleness, Martha embodied something far more complex. The disciplined, resilient force that held the Johnson household together while the nation threatened to tear itself apart. Martha grew up in the tight, overheated rooms above her father's tailor shop, learning early how to navigate the tensions of a household shaped by poverty, pride, and relentless striving. Of all the Johnson children, she absorbed her mother Eliza's strength most fully. Steadiness, silence used as strategy, an instinct for how to manage a difficult man without provoking or enabling him. These skills would become her life's defining tools. Her turning point came in 1855 when she married David T. Patterson, a Tennessee judge known for his calm demeanor. For a brief moment, her life seemed destined for ordinary domesticity. But history had other plans. When the Civil War erupted and Andrew Johnson rose from senator to military governor to vice president, Martha's role changed with each step. She became her mother's right hand, managing correspondence, organizing the household, and caring for her younger siblings as political threats mounted and loyalties shifted across Tennessee. Then came April 1865. Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, to the horror of some and relief of others, became president. Eliza, stricken by chronic illness, could not serve as White House hostess. Martha stepped into the position instantly, without ceremony, without training, and without the social polish enjoyed by first ladies of wealthier origins. Yet what she lacked in refinement, she replaced with discipline, warmth, and an intuitive understanding of political optics. Martha brought her dairy cow to the White House lawn to ensure her children had fresh milk. She repaired tattered furnishings, reorganized staff, and created a domestic environment that quietly communicated stability, while her father publicly clashed with Congress, vetoed Reconstruction measures, and faced impeachment. Guests described Martha as composed but unpretentious, a woman who understood that charm was not her role. Endurance was. During the impeachment crisis of 1868, Martha stood closest to her father, managing the household as hostile forces circled. When Andrew Johnson survived removal from office by a single vote, White House staff recalled Martha weeping in relief, not for political victory, but because her father would not be remembered as the first president cast out in disgrace. After the presidency ended in 1869, Martha returned with her family to Greeneville. She continued managing Andrew Johnson's household, especially after the deaths of her brothers Charles and Robert and her mother's rapid decline. When Andrew Johnson died in 1875, Martha oversaw his funeral and preserved his legacy with a fierce loyalty that bordered on guardianship. Martha Johnson Patterson's legacy is one of invisible statesmanship. She was not a first lady, yet she performed the role in one of the bitterest eras of American politics. She was not a politician, yet she read the emotional landscape of Washington more effectively than many senators. She was not a public figure, yet she carried the private weight of her father's presidency when the nation sought his downfall. Through Martha, we see the Andrew Johnson story not as the tale of a solitary, stubborn man, but as the story of a daughter who kept the household and her father's fractured dignity from collapsing under the pressure of a nation in crisis. The name Andrew Johnson is usually invoked as a cautionary tale. The president who clashed with Congress, resisted Reconstruction, and walked into the pages of history as a man out of step with the moment he was meant to lead. But when the story shifts from the Senate chamber to the Johnson household, a different narrative emerges. A family struggling under the weight of a patriarch whose rise from poverty to power brought with it not stability, but fracture. The lives of his 5 children reveal the hidden costs of ambition, trauma, and national crisis in ways that no political biography ever fully captures. Frank, the youngest, embodied Andrew's hope for redemption, the child born into the height of his father's fame. Yet the pressures placed upon him and the fragility of his health proved unbearable. His early death became the final echo of a dream Andrew Johnson never managed to secure, a legacy carried into the next generation. Robert, gentle and dutiful, carried the war in his body and the family burdens in his hands. His attempt to stabilize the Johnson household after the Civil War was crushed by illness, leaving behind another grave and another scar on a family already worn by loss. Mary, the quiet daughter, lived her life in the shadows of conflict, absorbing the emotional wreckage while the world focused on her father's battles with Congress. She held the household together through war, impeachment, and grief, the unacknowledged labor that ensures a family survives even when its name becomes a national controversy. Charles, fiery and volatile, inherited the darker side of Andrew Johnson's character. His service in the Union Army was honorable. But the demons that followed him, drink, anger, exhaustion, led to an early death that tore open wounds Eliza and Andrew never healed. He is the child who most clearly shows how the brutality of war and politics can hollow a man long before it kills him. And at the center stands Martha, the eldest, the steady hand behind a presidency defined by chaos. She became the de facto first lady, the household manager, the emotional stabilizer, the protector of her father's fragile dignity. Without her, the Johnson presidency, already strained by scandal and fury, would have collapsed under its own emotional weight. She held the family together when the nation tried to tear her father apart. Together, these 5 children illuminate a truth often buried beneath the politics of Reconstruction: that the rise and fall of Andrew Johnson was not a solitary journey. It was a family ordeal. Each child carried a piece of the burden he could not resolve. Each child bore the shadow of a man whose strengths and weaknesses were carved into the foundations of their lives. Andrew Johnson's public legacy remains controversial. But his private legacy, as seen through the lives of Frank, Robert, Mary, Charles, and Martha, is the story of a family that rose with him, suffered with him, and ultimately unraveled under the pressures history placed upon them. It is a reminder that the consequences of political leadership ripple far beyond the nation, reaching into the bedrooms, diaries, illnesses, and heartbreaks of the children who never chose the path that history forced them to walk.